For almost its entire existence, China has always been ruled by an emperor. From the Shah to the Qing, dynasties have ruled China since the beginning of civilization. This would change with the 1911 Nationalist Revolution, and for the next 40 years, China would be a land infested with soldiers and soaked in blood. For 200 years, the Qing dynasty ruled China, although its inability to effectively govern and widespread corruption led to events such as the Boxer Rebellion from 1899 to 1901. After this, China would modernize its military, equipping its troops with licensed copies of German Mausers and Western-style uniforms. These efforts came too little too late. In 1911, several members of the army revolted in the Wuchang Uprising. Revolutionaries from all over China soon began to rise up. The Qing court appointed Yuan Shikai prime minister, and negotiations with the revolutionaries began. On New Year's Day 1912, the revolutionaries formed a provisional government in Nanking. Sun Yat-sen, a popular intellectual, was appointed as the Republic of China's first president. Yet, monarchist forces in Manchuria still held out. Sun Yat-sen was able to end the war and unify China by offering the Qing prime minister the presidency if he switched sides. Yuan Shikai accepted the offer, and Sun stepped down from power. In 1916, Yuan declared himself emperor, defeating all the efforts of the revolutionaries. Once again, the nationalists revolted, and Yuan stepped down from power. Due to the region's instability, many generals took matters into their own hands and began to rule provinces as their own personal fiefdoms. For the next decade, China was in a state of anarchy. The reformed nationalist government battled several warlords over this tumultuous period of time. Many arms manufacturers noticed this and began to ship weapons to China. Soldiers from all factions could be seen with a variety of weapons. Most prominent were German guns, such as the Honggang Type 88, a licensed copy of the Gewehr 88, or Mauser's C96 pistol. In fact, the C96 got so popular that full auto carbine versions were made. Although, due to arms embargoes on many warlords, some soldiers were equipped with only a pistol and a sword. The Kuomintang Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party would cooperate in the First United Front. With aid in the form of supplies and advisors from the Soviet Union, the First United Front was able to defeat the majority of the warlords in the 1927 Northern Expedition. The differing ideologies between the nationalists and communists caused the rift between them to grow. And on April 12, 1927, Chiang Kai-shek, who succeeded Sun Yat-sen, ordered the purge of all known communists. The CCP was expelled from the government and began their insurgency against Chiang Kai-shek in the Nanjing province. Over the next few months, the CCP would attempt to take several regions, but generally failed. Yet, they were able to secure Wuhan. After a few losses and minor successes, Chiang launched a campaign to encircle the Jiangxi Soviet government in 1934. The KMT was largely successful. Mao Zedong, one of the founding Communist Party members, took his army and broke through the Nationalist Party lines. They marched 7,000 miles in the course of a year. At the end of it, only about 10% of Mao's forces were left. This trek came to be known as the Long March. When they arrived in Shanxi province, they recruited many locals, eventually rebuilding their numbers. The KMT would hire former bandits to undermine the local communists and warlords. Eventually, Zhao Yilongyi, another founding Communist Party member, would convince several warlords to help instigate the Xi'an incident in 1936. Chiang was placed under house arrest by his own generals and forced to form a second united front with Mao against the Japanese, who had been eyeing mainland China for some time. Japan had already occupied Manchuria in 1931, and now their sights were set to the south. A small Japanese force was on patrol near the Marco Polo Bridge. They demanded entry into the town of Wangping to search for a missing soldier. The Chinese refused them entry, and a firefight broke out. Both sides refused to negotiate, and Japan used the incident as an excuse to launch a full-scale invasion. To make things worse, a Japanese officer started a shootout in Shanghai, which resulted in his death. The small Japanese force stationed in their sector in Shanghai soon came under attack by nationalist forces. Both sides received reinforcements, and a brutal urban battle ensued. The two armies clashed in the rubble of Shanghai for a week. The Japanese would conduct an amphibious assault on August 22nd, outflanking the Chinese. Chiang Kai-shek ordered the 1st Battalion of the 524th Regiment to defend the Sihong warehouse. This unit was surprisingly trained and equipped by German advisors, so they would be able to effectively hold back the Japanese. The warehouse was just across the river from the international sector, and it was Chiang's hope that the world would notice this gallant defense and recognize the Chinese fighting prowess. The Japanese were unable to use heavy artillery to bombard the warehouse due to its proximity to the international sector. So for 5 days they launched infantry and tank attacks against the Chinese. After the 5 days were over, Chiang gave permission to retreat across the river. This was one of the last acts of defiance in Shanghai. Chinese troops would retreat towards Nanjing for threat of being encircled. The Japanese quickly pushed forward and captured the nationalist capital of Nanjing. This is where one of the darker events of the war happened, in the Nanjing Massacre, where 40,000 civilians were killed or abused. The event still affects international relationships between China and Japan to this day. The Japanese onslaught continued, capturing Wuhan. Luckily, Soviet aid gave the Chinese valuable supplies and weapons needed to halt the attackers. By 1939, the Chinese had halted the Japanese advance, and a stalemate ensued. The Japanese were also unable to defeat the CCP in Shanxi province, who conducted guerrilla warfare against them. Plus, with even more aid from the US and the famous American Volunteer Group, otherwise known as the Flying Tigers, the Chinese began to effectively hold back the Imperial Japanese Army. Although, in late 1940, clashes between the CCP and KMT resumed, effectively ending the Second United Front. Luckily, the international community was able to help convince the two parties to stop fighting each other and focus their efforts on the invaders. With the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America entered into the Second World War, turning a regional conflict in China into a front in a much larger war. And since 1942, the US and her allies have been pushing closer to mainland Japan, eventually threatening her supply lines to the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. With Japan's fleet all but destroyed by 1944, they opted to open a new overland supply route through China. The Japanese also hoped to capture American bomber bases that were chipping away at her manufacturing capabilities. Their attack began in mid-April. They thrust deep into South China, attacking along railways and roads. The Japanese captured many strategic targets, including the majority of the American airfields, although 80% of Japan's forces stationed in China took part in this offensive, resulting in large swaths of conquered territory being infested with communist guerrilla fighters and regulars. While the Ichigo offensive did achieve many of its goals, Japan was too stretched thin to effectively police the new territories. They did succeed in decimating the Nationalist Army, paving the way for a communist conquest of China proper. By 1945, it was clear that the war was coming to an end. Japan was on the back foot, losing ground in the Pacific and China. The Soviets launched a huge campaign to occupy the industrial heartland of China, Manchuria. Manchuria was currently under the control of the Japanese, but they quickly overran them and shipped the means of industry back to war-torn Russia. Stalin would also order that all captured Japanese weapons be given to the CCP troops, giving a well-needed supply boost to Mao's forces. In late August 1945, Chiang and Mao entered a peace negotiation, with the goal in mind to effectively end the fighting between the two of them. Although, skirmishes between nationalist and communist forces still broke out. By October, the Double Tenth Agreement was signed, which recognized the KMT as the ruling party of China. Yet relations would once again break down, and fighting resumed in 1946. Unlike the First Civil War, the Communists were in a much better position than the Nationalists. They had received a large cache of captured Japanese weapons from the Soviets and northern China. Meanwhile, the Nationalist forces had been ground down by the Japanese after almost a decade of fighting. On July 20th, Chiang launched an offensive into Manchuria. Yet, instead of facing him in open battle, Mao's forces opted to use guerrilla tactics, which they had been using since 1927. By the end of the year, 1.2 million KMT troops had been put out of action, either being killed, wounded, or captured. Although, they were able to secure Yan'an, the final destination of the Long March. This victory was most definitely a Pyrrhic one. By 1948, the CCP was on the offensive, and by 1948, they had secured northeastern China and captured a majority of the new First Army, which consisted of the KMT's best troops. The CCP pressed the attack. Using the captured nationalist equipment, they were able to conduct effective combined arms operations. They then secured even more of eastern China, capturing and even recruiting many KMT soldiers. The CCP began their final push south, in the Pingjing Campaign. In a matter of 64 days, they secured Zhangjiakou, Tianjin, Dagu, and Beijing. Out of the 600,000 nationalist troops deployed in the area, 520,000 were killed, wounded, or captured, destroying any last hope the KMT had of turning the tides of war. The KMT was in full retreat. The Communists soon captured Nanking, and by the end of the year, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government had retreated to Taiwan, with only a few pockets of resistance in Tibet. On October 1st, 1949, Mao held a rally in Beijing, proclaiming the founding of the People's Republic of China. After almost 50 years of on and off warfare, China was once again united under a single government. The People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, which is now based in Taiwan, never agreed on a peace deal. So technically, the war continues to this day. Mao would rule China until his death in 1976. Under his leadership, China faced many hardships, mostly caused by him. His attempt to reindustrialize China in the Great Leap Forward resulted in a famine that ended the lives of 45 million people. After said famine, Mao instituted the Cultural Revolution, which saw Chinese society drastically changed. as many ancient artifacts were confiscated or destroyed. Yet after his death, China would begin to open up to the rest of the world. And in 2024, China is one of the biggest exporters in the world. In short, the Chinese Civil War paved the way to our modern economy, and without it, our world would be very different. I am the low-budget historian, and this was the Chinese Civil War.